Hi, Sadie. We're going to take a look at your postings for the rhythm uh, and repetition, also the um, notan, the shadows and empty spaces postings. So let's go ahead and share screens, and we'll call up your repetition and just kind of make some observations here. So I'm just going to kind of work through just kind of going over, look at the overall projects, just in terms of exposure, looking at the entire compositions overall. Looks like you're using the entire compositional space, using the entire picture frame. All that stuff looks like you're exploring that part of it. Just in terms of using the entire space. That's a hurdle that a lot of students don't quite get through. So I'm glad you're working through that. Now let's look at some of these others, like alternating rhythms, the progressive rhythms, and so on. So what we have here, you have identified here as alternating rhythm, alternating rhythm, alternating rhythm, alternating rhythm. Now, these are all technically, yes, you've got them all organized. These are all alternating rhythms that you've got there. But as you can probably suspect it already when I said technically, meaning that there is not necessarily an issue, but there's a variance here that you're actually exploring that you may not be aware of. So what you've done here is you've taken an alternating rhythm, which is a brick or the repeating stairs, or the patterns on the stairs themselves, the little grids here on the stairs, or the repeating shapes here that are even and equal in distance from each other, or the repeating cars one after the other, so on and so forth. But notice what is about all of these. All of them are set on a diagonal. If you look at that, this is set on a diagonal. Even though it's a subtle diagonal, it's moving away from us, right? And this one, it's moving away from us. It's also moving up from us. So it's moving up and it's moving away. This one, it's moving at a distance away from us. They're not being presented as forward like this. They're being presented like this, right? And so the difference between something like this, I'm going to kind of jump off of the screen share real quick. So the difference between setting up something like this and like this is going to vary the difference between what kind of rhythm you're working with. But believe it or not, you can take the same group of objects and go from alternating rhythm, which is what this is, right? If I take my two hands and I put them directly up like this, I'm creating an alternating rhythm between the two of them. The closer they get together, the more tension that they have. The farther apart, the less tension that they have. So that's the nature of an alternating rhythm. Now, if I take those two hands and I do this to them, right, and I can even turn them like this, what I've done is I've taken the two hands and I've given them emphasis. So this hand is closer, it's larger than this hand. Now, what you get is depth, okay? So this hand goes deeper than this one. And also, this one steps backward from this one. So you got one and then two. We're moving in a direction. So we're no longer giving a comparative, we're giving preference. We're saying this one, then this one, and presumably there'd be another one back here if we had one. So what you've done is you've taken something here, which is the, basically the, you've taken these objects, and because we have them on a diagonal, you have this one closer and this one farther away, you're actually setting up a progressive rhythm with alternating patterns. So that is a more of a complex thing. So you've got here, this is an alternating rhythm, but you've set it up as a progressive rhythm. Because it's on a diagonal, it creates a movement that is something that we would want to use at times. Now, what we're trying to do is isolate them in these kinds of experiments. But what we want to do is what you're doing, and that is to use them in a more complex way. We want to be able to take these strategies and sort of fold them onto each other in unique ways so that we can move them forward. So I want to be sure that you're clear about, what we see here, and that is that these really aren't presenting alternating rhythms. They are the objects themselves, the patterns that you found are alternating in terms of their organization. But the way you're presenting them as a progressive rhythm. You see, now, so that's just kind of a really interesting thing. I haven't gone through everybody's images yet, but I haven't seen anybody doing that just yet. So now we have the undulating rhythm, which is for some people a little bit more difficult to grasp. Undulating rhythm is effectively just it's definitely a pattern, but the pattern can be a little less predictable. We tend to see some progression and we tend to see some alternating. When we get into trees like this is a different type of undulating rhythm. This is probably closer to the undulating rhythm that we're talking about. This, I'm not sure that is quite getting into the rhythm that we're hoping to get to. I see where you're going with it, though. You got the chairs here moving forward like that. Here, this is a progressive rhythm as we're looking back, and maybe that's what you're identifying at. But this is a decent example of an undulating rhythm that is moving progressively into the back. But let's get to this one just briefly, because this is a unique one in that you identified it as undulating, and I think with good reason, because you're seeing it as not alternating, certainly, and it doesn't feel exactly like it's progressive either, like building or de-escalating. So it must be undulating if it's not those other two. But not necessarily. This is yet a fourth one. We did mention it during the discussion, and it's called a dissonant rhythm. And dissonance is a rhythm that lacks pattern. So dissonant rhythms are something that is a repeating thing, something that has some sort of repetition, but it has no pattern to it. So in other words, we don't know where the next stem or twig or whatever might appear. When you look up in the stars, you can find some sort of patterns. We identify them as celestial bodies, and we connect them together and create these names and so on. But really, it's a rhythm that is difficult for us to put together, and hard for us to know when the next pattern might logically be if it's out of our field of vision. If you were to look at a grouping of sand, even, that's definitely a repetition, but what's the pattern? These kinds of things are called a dissonant rhythm, and this is what you've captured here as a dissonant rhythm. You notice the energy, the static nature of it, the kind of almost violent movement that goes on with it. It's definitely not a sort of free-flowing kind of feel. It's more like a snapping, kind of back forth everywhere kind of feel to it. It's a beautiful kind of rhythm to work with. It's really interesting, but it's not undulating. So these are all observations. You know that by now, that when I'm making these videos, that they're really more talking about what I see rather than what I think. Undulating rhythm, I can see this, yeah, where you would be looking at there. Is it the best? And probably others could be a better example of that. I think you got the best example here on that. This one is I can see how we're getting there, because you have this pattern that's going on, I guess, in this sort of circular pattern that's happening. There might have been a different way you could have put yourself into a different perspective that would have helped emphasize that a little bit more. Let's see. Progressive rhythm looks like you've got that more clearly, although you're using a lot of leading line in order to get that progressive rhythm, which there's nothing wrong with that, but there are other ways to do progressive rhythm other than leading line. But here you've got that interesting thing here. You're in a really narrow location here. I'm not seeing a whole lot of like moving around in the locations. There's a lot of repetition of right around the building, which is I suppose is okay. I would recommend like testing out some other spots as just as an experiment to stretch your visuals. This is a good example of the progressive rhythm. Is a very sort of solid example, technically, just a 1 and a 2 and a 3. And then even with the leading line here with the cement, the 2, and then you've got the 3 kind of coming over on this side. That's a very well seen. With each of these, I think we tend to find the ones that are more connected to our own sort of pre-existing aesthetics, what we've already are drawn to. Some people to alternating, some people to progressive. It looks like progressive rhythms are something that you are already sort of thinking about because you're doing them in almost all of your photos. All of them pick up on a little bit of a progressive rhythm to begin with. So that's probably something you've been looking at before you had a name for it. Because this, again, is a very good job in terms of organizing a progressive rhythm. So let's take a look at the notan and see what we have here. So we have these shadows. And really, you know, as we discuss these, this idea, we're going from this sort of general to specific in terms of using composition. We start out with the emphasis, and which is just from distance, different distances, and then we get into the golden ratio and the 5 grid, which is more of a sort of framework. And then we work with the rhythm and repetition, which is more about leading the eye in different directions. And now we're working more with almost like subject here, where we're looking at the subject and identifying a different type of subject, or using the subject in a different way. Using a shadow rather than the thing itself transforms it into a compositional element much easier than the thing itself. So for instance, something like this, where we have the shadow of this tree, we're getting the same benefit of the shape, right? I mean, whether we were looking at the twigs or we're looking at the shadow of the twigs, we're getting the same benefit, meaning the same line work, the same patterns, all of that stuff is still there. In fact, we're getting a little bit more of an accentuated version of that because we're getting softness and we're getting rounded edges. Some of them are sharper, some of them are not as sharp. But at the same time, we can juxtapose that. We can overlay it onto other things like this pattern of the cement. We can combine it with these things. This is why we want to use these kind of things. We start to develop layers in our photography, the way that a painter would develop layers in their imagery. They would build up layers. We build up layers of light. We build up layers of our images this way, using patterns of light, using shadows, using highlights, and so on. The more simplified the composition, the more direct and powerful it can be. Even if we were to lose these little indication of these cars here and here, I don't think you'd lose much in this photograph because the real strength is in this pattern that you've created here, here, and then over in here in the texture. The black and white also is a very good choice because you're reducing it down to just the shadows. See, you're getting really into like more of the minimal, and what it's doing is it's helping our eyes focus more on this. You may not be actually seeing some of this stuff in your viewfinder. Viewfinders don't always give you 100% of what you're looking at. So we really don't need this little triangle that's way up here. You probably didn't see it. Same thing with this one right up here. You probably didn't see that triangle. There are some things that inevitably, when we get to editing in different classes, you'll want to do to sort of clean up or fine tune the images. Here, we're just working with composition. We want you to be able to get 95% there before we get into starting to do any modifications. This image is 95% there. We've got lots to work with. See all this texture in here? We get the benefit of the tree but also the benefit of that beautiful texture juxtaposed with the cracks in the sidewalk. It's just, this is why we're having to do. So you're doing a great job with these shadows, just what we're looking for. Again, this is so much more than just a tree and the shadow. Now, here's the thing about people. My eye went right to the person, and most everybody else's eye is going to go right to the person. There's a hierarchy of things that human beings want to look at, and people are right at the top. People are going to be the first thing that you're going to want to look at in a photograph, in a picture. If there's another person there, you're going to want to look at it. That's going to be the focus. It's going to be really difficult for you to not make that the first main focus. So be aware of that. The second thing would be any kind of type or text. The third thing would be a point of high contrast. So you have these different things that we know. Whoops, I think I broke my microphone there. Hope that didn't make a loud noise. There's three types of emphasis that we want to really be aware of, because when we include them, they might be fighting against what we're intending. So be aware of those. The person back here is only distracting us from what you might want us to be viewing. So it might have been better to wait for them to exit your frame before making this image. It's a lot to think about, but there it is. You know, good old Photoshop, we could probably take that one out. But it's an excellent image nonetheless, but just be aware of those kinds of things. Here we are with the leading lines again. I am seeing a repetition of imagery here. We don't want that. Please don't include photographs from another batch in a future batch. So we don't want to repeat images. We don't want to mine our, you know, our archive for images for another project. The whole point of doing these projects will be to explore the topic at hand while it's in our mind. If we were to simply go back to image we've already shot and try to identify something we already did, we're robbing ourselves of the actual learning opportunity. So we don't want to do that. Avoid that in the future, okay? Shadows, beautiful. You're doing a really good job of working with these otherwise. There's, again, we'll pay more close attention to things like this. See it when you make your images next. If stuff like this, just take a note. Deliberately try to put something toward the edge there, make a photo, and then later bring it on the computer and know that that photo was made specifically to test this thing, just to see how much of an object that you think is not there does in fact show up. And that'll help you to be able to next time figure out whether something like that trash can or whatever that thing is either in the shot or not in the shot, but you'll know, you know, you're gonna get what you see. So that's basically what I have for you. I'm seeing a lot of really good images here. Definitely have, you know, some things to clarify. We've identified some of the things you're already working very well in, that you intuitively are going toward, that progressive rhythm into the leading lines, which create that atmospheric depth. That seems to be a real natural thing for you to do. So we want to keep moving on that so that you can develop it. But also, I want to see you kind of bring back in the opposite direction too, to work on some of those things that maybe aren't occurring to you, like trying to flatten space, trying to do something like, see how this plant is behind me. Watch what happens when I stick my hand right underneath it, directly below it, like that, right? What happens is it looks like I kind of compress space almost when I do that, right? It almost can appear that the plant is, or the little vase is sitting on my finger like that. That's a compression of space that you can do when you align things very two-dimensionally and line them up like that. So experiment with that kind of stuff. So we'll see more of your photographs, of course, and we'll catch up in the studio if you have any questions. All right, bye now.